Hello, I'm Anthea Hancox, the CEO of the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute, and we are delighted to bring you this special limited series of our Voices of Australia podcasts. As always, this podcast was recorded on the land of the Kulin Nation's Wurundjeri people, and we pay our deepest respects to elders past and present. I am welcoming you to the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute's new 6-part limited podcast series, Truth, Trust and Politics, a podcast that explores the complexities of truth, trust and political communication as we approach the 2025 federal election campaign. From mistruths and manipulative tactics to the erosion of trust in political communication, this series unpacks the dynamics that shape modern politics. We'll ask critical questions: who stands to gain from misinformation? Who's most vulnerable to its influence? And most importantly, what can we do to clean up our discourse and rebuild trust in our democratic processes? Featuring community thought leaders, politicians and policymakers, journalists and researchers, we'll explore the role of truth in shaping voter perceptions, the impact of social media, and strategies to counter the growing influence of mistruths. Join our guest host, Mary Gearin, award-winning journalist, MC and facilitator, as we examine how misinformation and the decay of trust impacts social cohesion, who it affects most, and what we can do to foster a healthier, more informed democracy. Mary's guest for this episode is Andrea Carson, Associate Professor at La Trobe University, whose research focuses on democracy, disinformation, and the changing media landscape. They'll discuss the role of social media in amplifying misinformation and the evidence around who's most vulnerable to mistruths.
Andrea Carson, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure.
You have done so much work looking at mis and disinformation, in particular during the Voice referendum. Can you tell us what you did there and what you found?
Well, the larger project that I was doing with colleagues on the Voice to Parliament referendum was really trying to map the information ecosystem, because it's much more than a media ecosystem now. People get their information, as you know, Mary, from social media and from websites and from legacy media, from friends and family, and they can get it anywhere. It knows no geographical boundaries as in the past. So part of it was mapping the campaigns, the Voice to Parliament, seeing where the key messages were, what those messages were, and using AI and large language models to help us with that. So during that process, we analysed 3.3 million posts and media stories. And in that, we were also very interested in mis and disinformation, specifically that was targeting the Electoral Commission. Because as a political scientist and a former journalist, my interest really is that intersection between politics and media. And of those 3.3 million posts, and we're looking at some of the tropes that have come from America, like stolen election and rigged election, we found about 5,000 that related to those. So you can see that it's a small proportion of the overall landscape specifically on that form of mis and disinformation. And that reflects what we see in the literature in America and other places, that actually mis and disinformation is a very small part of the information landscape.
It's a small part, but is it potent in the sense that you have found evidence that it can start small and go big, or does it stay contained?
It's an important question. We find it's stickier than normal information. And what we mean by normal information, then information that's not controversial. So what I mean by stickier is that it usually has more engagement than, say, a post that isn't controversial. And so it does have the potential to have greater reach than those non-controversial posts. So yes, it can be damaging in that respect. And that's why I guess there's so much concern about the consequences of mis and disinformation.
And of course that the stickiness of controversial messaging aligns very closely, doesn't it, with what that does in fact to politics, where politics of fear, for instance, is found to be stickier as well. To what extent can you say that social media mis and disinformation has actually changed politics?
I love your questions because this is exactly some of the research we've been doing, always with colleagues, because you need to bring a lot of different skill sets to bear when you're looking at mis and disinformation. Psychologists, data analysts, journalists, political scientists are some of the key areas, but certainly not limited to that. So we've known for a long time that fear messages have greater traction than other types of messages in politics. And politicians are very artful when it comes to messaging because they need to be. They need to influence voters and so forth. And we see a convergence really where fear messaging can switch over into mis and disinformation. So when I first became interested in this space back in 2016, one of the first studies was the Mediscare campaign in Australia, which is clearly a fear campaign, but it also had elements of disinformation. And I guess it's a good opportunity to explain the differences between mis and disinformation.
Yeah, please do.
Disinformation is, I guess, a subset of misinformation. Some like to say it's the deliberate spread. I like to go a step further than that and say you need to operationalise the intent. You can't just say it's deliberate because it's hard to divine what people are thinking. So if you see actions like superposting, cut and pasting of the same message that's spread across platforms, that's obviously done with intent, which is a disinformation campaign. Misinformation is just wrongful information that is spread, and that's where it gets confusing because something that is disinformation can be haplessly spread by those who don't realise, and so it can switch between mis and disinformation. So this is a long way of saying that when we tracked the Mediscare campaign, we found that the ads that Bob Hawke was the face of, you might remember, talking about the threat of Medicare being dissembled, we found that elevated the salience of the issue of health and improved the Labor vote by 3%.
Oh, really?
But we also find that these things are short-lived. So it lasted for about 4 days, which was kind of convenient because those ads rolled out every week. There was a new one, and then we saw that salience lift again. We saw a lift in the Labor vote, but we didn't see a lift in rusted-on coalition supporters back in 2016. So this speaks to a broader issue of mis and disinformation, that just because people see it or engage with it doesn't necessarily mean it changes behaviours. There have to be other preconditions for it to be effective.
That's really interesting. What sort of conditions play into that?
So political allegiance is an obvious one, ideology, but it's also about in-groups and out-groups, people wanting to belong, motivated reasoning. People have strong reasons for staying with their particular viewpoint. And there's also marginalised and vulnerable groups in society that might want to belong to an area, to a group, so therefore they're agreeing with content or sharing it. And so a really nuanced approach needs to be taken when you're, I guess, as a government trying to deal with mis and disinformation and its potential harmful consequences.
That ties into some other conversations we've had in this podcast series about how politics has created the problem itself by creating people who are disengaged and disillusioned, and then they are more likely then to believe the mistruths. Is that part of what you're saying?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that it can be a vicious cycle, but also we know that misinformation drives distrust, but distrust also drives misinformation. So the causality runs both ways. And we know in Australia that political trust is fairly low. We know this from the excellent work that comes out of the Australian National University, the regular electoral survey they do after every election, which has been tracking since 1987, that Australians have low political trust. They also increasingly have low media trust. So you've got these preconditions of that allows other forms of information to potentially be influential. And some of that information that's influential comes from what we now call influencers. And political elites also have a disproportionate role in influencing people's viewpoints.
When it comes to disinformation, the more organised and sometimes very technologically driven ways of misleading people, how is it best to tackle that?
Well, the first thing to note is it's not just spread on social media. It's also spread in mainstream media. But
in what ways?
Not all media is equal. of the news media, and some news media has agendas. And in the Voice to Parliament, for example, the No campaign was amplified by certain sectors of the media, and some of the mistruths around the No campaign were also amplified by sections of the media, of mainstream media, and consumed and replicated on channels such as YouTube, and also most media channels also colonise social media and post up their stories on the various social media platforms. So there is a degree of symbiosis between the two, and misinformation and disinformation moves between mainstream media and social media, and we've seen that in a number of studies that we've done. So when it comes to regulating it, you can't just deal with the platforms alone, because that's just one space where it appears. At the moment, Australia has a voluntary code of mis and disinformation, which is responsibility of the platforms to identify mis and disinformation and show transparency of how they're tackling that. But they deal with it separately. Often disinformation is dealt with by a separate unit within social media platforms compared to misinformation. And this is where it can get a little bit messy because, as we've discussed, mis and disinformation can move around. Something that's disinformation can be misinformation. And so it's not a perfect solution. But harmful disinformation, usually the platforms recognise that. They use a lot of AI technology to identify it, and they'll take that down. They haven't had a policy of taking down misinformation because often that's, while it may not be right, it's deemed as low quality information. And there's always a trade-off about freedom of expression as well as censorship, really. And so is it best to leave low quality information there or to take it down? Now, some of that thinking changed during COVID, where misinformation was taking down because there were real world harms when people were spreading false measures on how to tackle COVID that were actually detrimental to health. But Facebook, for example, has reversed that policy since and now doesn't take down misinformation, but it will take down disinformation.
And because of the stickiness that you've referred to, it's in their business model, isn't it, for them to potentially keep misinformation around, because if it does keep people engaged?
There's, I guess, a common argument that, they're a profit-motivated company, but there's also reputational harm if they continue to ignore these things. And the EU's been on the front foot since 2016. It had its mis and disinformation code, which Australia replicated. It's since moved that to a mandatory code that attaches not just incentives for the platforms to deal with the amount of low-quality information on their platform, it puts in penalties. Australia tried to do that in 2024 with its latest mis and disinformation bill, and it had huge opposition. So it shows that regulating that type of content is not easy, and some of that opposition, surprisingly, came from News Corp, which is a mainstream media organisation, which was scoped out, exonerated from being held to account in that piece of legislation. So that might be a little bit mystifying to some listeners, and for good reason.
So let's get to what can be done, I guess. You're talking about a really complex space, and I'm sure everyone's still just figuring it out. But if fear messaging and misinformation is, compelling and is hard to counter, yet you were saying earlier that it's not necessarily going to get someone to believe a mistruth. What's the window of opportunity there for progressive or any sort of messaging that might try and, steer its way through the fear, through the lies?
Well, as you've identified, it's a complicated space, and therefore it needs a whole of society approach. There's not just one tool that we can apply that's going to deal with this huge global problem. And there's various tools that we have, and they need to come together, and we also need greater coordination and collaboration with stakeholders. Some of these tools are obviously third-party fact-checking units, whether they operate on the platforms, because the platforms do pay for third-party fact-checking to identify what is clearly false information and to provide a rationality for why that's false. And they will reduce the algorithm on that content. So that's one component. Other components are greater media literacy and digital literacy, educating the public about how to identify fact from fiction. Another, I think, very powerful tool here is early flaggers, people in civil society that are already respected by their communities. And this operates in Indonesia, where they have a direct line into the technology companies. So when they see a disinformation campaign taking hold, say targeting minority groups, often women or the LGBTIQA+ communities, they're able to say, we're seeing this on the ground through our networks, watch for it on social media. The other thing that needs to happen is greater coordination between the platforms, because usually if a disinformation campaign starts, say, on Instagram, you can bet it's going to be on TikTok too or YouTube. And so if the platforms are coordinating with each other, they have the opportunity to stem it before it really takes hold. Because I guess once the egg's scrambled, it's very hard to unscramble it. So you want to get on top of these things early, which is why the post-bunking measures that I've spoken about, like fact-checking, have limitations. You need to get to it before it's already spread. Otherwise, you're playing this whack-a-mole game where you're identifying individual pieces and then debunking them. Not only is that time-consuming, laborious, and often contested, it doesn't mean that the people who saw the initial disinformation are actually going to see the debunked piece at the other end. So getting onto this early with early flaggers and coordination between the platforms, greater coordination too between key stakeholders like academics, politicians, journalists, teachers, and the platforms, of course, is needed. But of course, it's not an easy thing to do.
Absolutely. There's so much in there to unpack, but just sort of tying together what you said about having these trusted individuals and also the fact-checking. As you have said, the fact-checking institutions themselves have been attacked for fact-checking, and fact and truth has become part of identity wars for some people, some politicians, and some bad faith actors as well. Do you see that as a real problem, that essentially just this move to politicise truth, as it were, or to tar it as part of the identity war?
Yes, I do. And the reason for that is Australia's a fairly nascent fact-checking environment. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry and it has grown rapidly. It started in the States in 2003 with PolitiFact. It quickly became politicised in the United States, so there's a plethora of fact-checkers. Some of them are right-leaning fact-checkers, some are left-leaning fact-checkers, some run out of universities, claim to be neutral, but there's degrees of ideology that's attached to them. In Australia, because we didn't start to about the 2010s onwards, and there's relatively few fact checkers, it was seen as a fairly neutral space. And the platforms need an organisation that has a reputation for impartiality in order to be effective. But again, in the Voice to Parliament referendum, we saw some of that politicisation that has occurred in the United States happening in Australia with attacks on RMIT fact labs. And part of that, it's a long story, so I won't go into it, but part of that was because that fact checker fact-checked News Corp, and News Corp didn't like that, and so they ran a campaign against it. We did a study in real time when that was going on, and we found public trust in that fact checker plummeted as a consequence of that media campaign against it. And I think that's a real shame and a lost opportunity to utilise the potential of fact checkers. Now, there's other fact checkers like AAP that still have high trust, and we've measured in various surveys the trust of fact checkers, and it is relatively high in Australia. But there's another problem here, and that is in one study we did on political content, we found once it gets fact-checked, a third of our 4,000 respondents still shared it anyway, even knowing it was fact-checked as incorrect.
Wow. That's amazing. So How do you counter that?
So we asked them, why did you share it? And we found those, again, we've got motivated reasoning, politically motivated reasoning. Those on the left of politics, this was a piece of information about Scott Morrison when he was Prime Minister, where he was erroneously portrayed as saying something very negative about flood victims in Queensland, which was false. Those on the left said they shared it because even though he may not have said it, it was the kind of thing he would say in their words, and they wanted to highlight what sort of individual they thought he was with false information. Those on the right shared it because they said this is the type of thing people on the left do and people need to be aware of it. And those that weren't identifying politically would share it because either they had a real immense dislike for Facebook where they saw this piece of misinformation or disinformation, and or they didn't like the ABC, and it was ABC RMIT Fact Check that was one of the fact-checking brands that we were using in this study.
It's just such a complicated space. At that point when political allegiances are essentially embracing mistruths, what's the way through then? As you say, you talk about social media literacy. There's a move to take children out of that space, in fact. With your permission, can we go there? This space hasn't happened yet, but I know that's not part of your studies at the moment. But how much social media literacy should people have? Can they, if they opt out of social media, is that the way to do it?
No, I don't think it is for a number of reasons. First of all, that the legislation, when it comes into effect, is going to be very hard to operationalise, to actually make it work. So there's going to be lots of workarounds if kids want to be on social media. It might also have an unintended consequence of pushing kids out into very unregulated spaces like 4chan or 8chan or dangerous sites. Some things are not included in the legislation, like Minecraft, the game, where there's where kids are able to interact with others through those gaming tools. And there's been studies and police reports that show that is a place where pedophiles groom their victims. So it's not a catch-all legislation. The other thing is, though, that social media is part of our world, whether we like it or not, and it has been for some time now. And building resilience and literacy is an important part of that, and expecting kids as soon as they turn 16, if they've been banned from the platform, to suddenly have all those skills is also problematic. But there's a broader argument that the internet should be safer for everyone, not just for children, and why we're singling out one sector of society. But the other thing that I think listeners would be interested to know is that the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford, where I spent some time this year, they do a regular check on the state of the media every year with massive cross-national studies of about 47 countries. And what they find in those studies is that the more gullible or trusting people on social media are the elderly. It's not the youth. Youth actually have a pretty good sensor about what's true, what's not true, what's believable, what's not. And also, interestingly, those on the right side of politics are also more trusting than those on the left with social media.
Can you repeat that? The ones on the right side of politics are more trusting of social media than the ones on the left?
Yeah.
What's going on there?
I don't know, but that's what the data shows. It could be that those on the left often have a greater news diet than those on the right. So they're getting more cross-cutting information that is challenging and intersecting their viewpoints, whereas those on the right tend to have a more homogenous news diet, and therefore they're trusting fellow travellers in the kinds of information that they're encountering. That's one theory, but obviously that's a space for more research.
Oh, absolutely. Just going back to something you said there about the youth who have been brought up on, these platforms and native to the platforms, as they say. I remember hearing about how, young girls in particular weren't as worried as potentially their parents about photoshopped images, because they reported that they would just assume that things were manipulated. And when we think about AI-generated false images and so forth, is there a way in which the human race is adapting to understand that what they see they may not be able to believe, and that is part of the protection?
We've kind of had this experiment before when moving image first came out with film and photography, a long time ago now and before you and I, but there were the same sorts of debates, because photography by its very nature is a manipulated image in some respects, as is film. And there was great concern when those technologies first started to evolve. And now we're in, of course, an AI space, generative AI space, where it's the barriers to entry are very low. Anyone can harness these tools really to be able to manipulate images. So there needs to be a high level of skepticism in society about what we're seeing is believing or not. So while I think I understand concerns about the idea of epistemic crisis, about how do people know what's real and what's not real, I do think particularly Australians have a reasonable, healthy degree of skepticism.
Yeah, whether it comes to social media or not, just about everything.
Yeah, that's right.
So to try and twist some optimism into this as well, can social media itself be part of the solution here? Can it actually draw people together? Or have we seen with what's happened with Twitter, for instance, that proven to be a false hope?
I think the answer to that's probably a bit both ways, which I know is unsatisfying. I'll give you an example of the Voice to Parliament when we did this study of those 3.3 million posts. What we found was 45 major narratives that came out from the yes and the no side, many more from the yes side than there were from the no, which is not unexpected because there were more yes campaigners and more yes official campaigns, so they had more disparate spread out messaging. But what we found, which challenges echo chamber theory, was that the yes and no interacted with each other all the time. So when we graph up these narratives, what we see is that there might be a narrative that starts from the no campaign. I'll give you an example. At one point, we all know that no was peddling the idea that the Voice to Parliament would be divisive. And one of the particular strands of that narrative was that it would be like having an apartheid. So what we see when we graph that up is that this narrative starts to surge on social media. Then we see those supportive of the yes side come in and negate that argument. And so it ends up being this graph, a bit like a dance or a helix, where the yes and the no bounce up and down as they're responding to each other, which shows that they are engaging in quite robust argument. But that doesn't stop it becoming a polarised space, because I don't think they're changing each other's minds. I think they're engaging with each other's content and arguing with each other, but they may not be changing minds. Having said that, if we go back to 2022, the Voice to Parliament had 65% public support. Now, obviously, people did change their minds, or that might have been because the issue wasn't particularly salient at the time. So when people are filling out a survey, they're not spending a lot of time thinking about it. And as we got closer to polling day, they're starting to really concentrate their minds on it. But people obviously did have to think about it, and some people did change their minds. So I think social media is a space for engagement. Whether it's positive or negative, I think depends on the content.
So just as a final question, and this is a very big question to end on, how confident are you that trust can be restored in political discourse, and how does that happen?
Yeah, that is a big question. Thanks, Mary. With a group of colleagues at Griffith University, we're working on this very question, and we're year 2 out of a 5-year Australian Research Council grant. And what we find is that political trust, as I said before, is quite low in Australia, and so is institutional trust is also beginning to fall. And we're trying to unpack why that is. And we find that trust is a complicated concept, and people apply different perspectives to trust depending on whether they're talking about a politician or an institution. And some of these perspectives is they might judge it on how benevolent someone is and what their competence is, on what their past record has been, likability. There's lots of factors that come into play on how people evaluate the trustworthiness of someone. And misinformation and disinformation obviously creates noise and doesn't help this space. But I think in order for me to be optimistic about answering this, we need greater leadership. And by that, we need our political elites, and we know that people pay attention to political elites. There's a theory around this, political elite Q theory. Politicians need to be exemplars. But because politics is a competitive game, there's often a race to the bottom, or as we've talked about, the inclination to use very powerful levers like fear campaigns. So politicians do need to try and resist that because it hurts the overall system and just reduces public trust. Now, how you rebuild or you get politicians to be exemplars and to improve political discourse. And I don't want to use a blanket characterisation here because obviously not all politicians are the same, and there's people that go into it for various motivations, and some politicians are doing an amazing job. But you need to lift the tide so that it starts building trust, and we need strong guardrail institutions. And by that, I mean the Electoral Commission, corruption commissions, having strong checks and balances between a federation and the states. They're the sorts of things that can help build confidence in the overall system, and we need to not inadvertently drag those institutions down. And I guess just to end on a controversial note, that's why the Truth in Political Advertising bill is not a straightforward one. It can be a seductive argument to say, well, let's pass law to stop politicians lying. The problem is who implements that. If it's a guardrail institution like the Australian Electoral Commission, they have a position of neutrality and very high public trust at the moment. If you start giving them a political role of determining what's fact from fiction, that can damage that. And we've already found in another study we did with the Voice to Parliament that those that saw disinformation against the Electoral Commission had less trust in it. So we don't want to make the Electoral Commission a deliberate target.
Yeah, and listeners can hear a bit more of a dig down into the Truth in Political Advertising law notion, as it still remains in Australia, in another episode as well. Andrew, Carson, always fascinating to talk to you. I'd love to catch up with you at the end of that 5-year study as well and see what else you come up with. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for the tough questions.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. For more episodes, check out our website at scanloninstitute.org.au.